In my last build update, I said that I was going to experiment with Archmage, and now I have, so I'm going to talk about it in a build showcase for the endgame version of Archmage Fireball Frostwall. Now, like with the last video, let's start things off with a quick little disclaimer. This is an endgame build, it has complex mechanics, and it's very easy to get the gearing wrong. So, I highly recommend you watch this video start to finish, and maybe even rewatch certain sections if there's anything you're unsure about. I'll do my best to explain everything, but if there's something you're confused about, feel free to ask down in the comments and you might get an answer either from me or from someone else who watched the video and knows the answer to your question. So far, this setup hasn't been nerfed. I'm honestly kind of surprised at that, given how strong Archmage is and given how strong Lightning Conduit is. If Conduit gets nerfed, by the way, this build will be totally fine. If Archmage does, we'll have to see. And the best way to know if the build is fine, if there is an Archmage nerf, is to get subscribed and ring that notification bell to see whenever I upload. Now, as one other note, I'm not going to go into too many details of the exact mechanics or scaling on how Eldritch Battery and the Everlasting Gaze amulet works. That's because I've already explained this in a previous video, which I'll link up in the card and down below. If you have any questions on that specific interaction, do be sure to watch it after this. I first started this build because my Cast on Freeze character was broken, and since then, it's morphed into something quite different. In a lot of ways, you could say I went from zero to hero, because now there are times where I feel like an unkillable god, and I can obliterate bosses in a mere couple casts. In fact, I farmed the last bit of money that I needed to finish out this build by doing Tier 4 Xesht, a fight that was rather unfair, and by that I mean it was rather unfair for him. So, this build is really good when mapping, it can do Tier 4 bosses, and so far I haven't found any area of the game that it can't succeed at the very least if you have enough gear, because this is significantly more gear dependent than the previous versions of the build that I played. But the core mechanics of the build have remained the same. Drop Frostwall, then detonate it with Fireball for massive explosive clear. Or on a boss, drop a bunch of Frostwalls, put down a Flame Wall. If you're really feeling like you want to put in high effort, drop the Conductivity Curse, then detonate it with Fireballs to explode the boss. And hey, if it's a bigger boss that's going to survive all that damage, your Lightning Conduit goes off and fries it. Using the combination of Frostwall and Fireball means this build excels at clearing indoor maps where your Fireball naturally explodes everywhere. It means you can clear outdoor maps where normally your Fireball would struggle by force detonating it with a Frostwall, and it means you have Burst Single Target, which goes into the millions if you set everything up correctly. Now, since the last time I talked about this build, there is one other major upgrade. And this one has everything to do with damage. I have the Snake Pit Ring. You must wear this in your left ring slot, which causes projectiles from spells to fork. So, instead of your Fireball hitting an enemy, exploding, and shooting a bunch of projectiles out, now your Fireball splits into 2 or 3. Those multiple projectiles hit the Frost Wall, explode, and that's right, send out a bunch of projectiles for even more projectiles and even more damage. This is a significant DPS upgrade, but it does mean you need even better resistances on your other pieces. And once you have it, you should instill Split Shot, so when your projectiles fork, they have a 75% chance to fire 3 instead of a standard 2. Now in addition to this, I've also swapped around my reservations. I'm now running Archmage, which reserves 100 Spirit, I'm running Grim Feast, which reserves 30, and I'm running Cast on Shock, which reserves 60 for 190 total. But, because my amulet is the Everlasting Gaze, getting past 160 is pretty rough. So there are 2 solutions to this. The first is to use Against the Darkness, a Time Lost Diamond. It gives you 8 to 12, and you do need a roll of 10 or better here, to Spirit for every notable passive skill in Radius. So, you can put it here, and click Austerity Measures, Calibration, or Reverberation. If you have 1 extra skill point, so level 93 or higher, you could actually drop Austerity Measures, pick up Repulsion for a little bit more damage, then make up for the stun over at Hallowed. Also, if you cannot afford a controlled metamorphosis, you could put it here as 3 nodes, Hallowed, Heavy Buffer, and Illuminated Crown would fall in the radius. However, it is much better to have the controlled metamorphosis here, and also Illuminated Crown would be a dead node that does nothing for your build. So I would say putting it there is suboptimal. Now, if you can't afford this, don't want to, or get really lucky, you can also get 30 Spirit as a corruption on your helmet. I actually think this could be the best in slot option for really late endgame, but it means corrupting a bunch of really expensive items, many of which you will brick. So do that at your own risk. And last but certainly not least, a little bit of a PSA, because a few people told me they were dying to what felt like random one-shots and they couldn't figure out why. And I suspect the answer is a caustic mana flask. If you are using a mana flask that says it removes a percentage of recovery from your life, if you only have one life, this kills you instantly, and then says something in the chat that if I said it out loud on YouTube or even showed it, there's a chance this video would get demonetized. So yeah, don't use that mana flask mod. But now, with that out of the way, let's get into a few more details about the build. So, here I have my Stormweaver Ascendancy. I'm allocating Constant Gale to get Arcane Surge, which is more cast speed and more mana regeneration rate. Force of Will to scale it absolutely ridiculously, because I have so much maximum mana. Right now I have 5,055, which translates to about 337% increased effective Arcane Surge. Then, you want to strike twice for double shock. This is a massive damage multiplier. And last but not least, Scouring Winds to put enemy resistances very, very low, possibly into negative when you shock them and thus inflict exposure. So, speaking of, let's go over skills. First up, Fireball. When Fireball hits some objects, it explodes, adding more projectiles. Wild Shards gives it a chance to fire all of its projectiles in a nova. This is really fun, especially if you have Unleash and you get a whole bunch of fireballs that also nova. And of course, when I'm trying to demonstrate it, it doesn't want to do that. I think this is the longest I've ever gone without a Wild Shards proc. Wow, this is ridiculous. It's like a 1 in 5 on every cast. There we go. Haha, we did it. So, the whole point of this build is to create frost walls, shotgun the fireballs into them, so that all the projectiles explode immediately, doing massive shotgun damage at point-blank range. To further enhance this, use Flame Wall, because now, as your projectiles pass through a flame wall, they gain damage, and then they explode, dealing even more damage, because the frost walls also deal lots of damage. So in Fireball, you want Scatter Shot, Unleash, Wild Shards. Think of this as the core. Then Rising Tempest and Controlled Destruction. These are optional extra damage things. As a note, you do also take Psychic Fragmentation, which is why sometimes there's a whole bunch of extra projectiles, even regardless of the Unleash procs. And on Frostwall, Spell Cascades, you get the nice juicy walls. Ingenuity, so you can spam the button more. Overcharge, for increased magnitude of shocks to make your shocks more effective. Lightning Exposure, to inflict exposure when shocking, because this will almost always shock. And Considered Casting, to make sure it hits hard enough to actually shock very reliably. Next up, Flame Wall. The gem level here matters because that adds more flat damage, which is also why you want Fire Mastery to raise the level. The other two supports, Arcane Tempo and Persistence, are just quality of life. They're not very important. Now for Conductivity, this is an optional thing on bosses. It creates a glyph that triggers inflicting a curse. Heightened Curse increases the effect, and Magnified Effect means it happens on a bigger area, so you can be bad at aiming. But realistically, the supports here are just quality of life and completely up to you. Then Lightning Warp. This is a culling strike effect, really good for culling big bosses. And the Shock Siphon here, recover 4% of energy shield, is, again, just quality of life. You don't need it. But you do also get a fair amount of damage from Cast on Shock with Lightning Conduit. There's two ways to focus into this. First is with Energy Retention, Impetus, Inspiration, and Concentrated Effect. This is if you want it to go off primarily on single target. But you could also set it up to go off more when clearing. And if you do that, you can drop Concentrated Effect for Elemental Focus so it has bigger AoE. Alternatively, if you want even bigger damage for big bosses, and you can sustain the costs, more about that in a second when I talk about gearing, you can also drop Inspiration for LE Focus and keep the Conk effect. Which one you end up doing is honestly kind of dependent on your gear. but most of the time I do quite like the inspiration, and then for big bosses I'll swap this out for Ellie Focus when I really want the damage. I don't need the extra help mapping, so I keep Conk Effect in the entire time. On Archmage, the level really does matter, because at level 21, it goes from 8 to 9% damage. You can see this here, 8 to 9. So either you spend 3 Divines on a level 20 gem, and you put in Lightning Mastery, or you get a level whatever gem you want, make it 20% quality because the quality adds damage, which is important, and then you corrupt it. If it gets +1 level from corruption, you can then level it up all the way to 19. It has +1 from corruption, which makes it 20, +1 from Lightning Mastery, which makes it 21. Then last but not least, Grim Feast, which adds a huge amount of healing / survivability while mapping. Not strictly required, but it does feel very good, and I honestly wouldn't recommend mapping without it. Next up, we have the passive tree. Now, this version is specifically set up for these radius jewels, but you can path around, so basically going through here, and fill out these nodes manually, because you do still want overexposure, and you do still want Eldritch Will. Also, you'd definitely be taking the points on the left to get to Dependable Ward. With that said, these are very good, so if you can afford them, you should absolutely use them. And if you're looking for something to drop to get extra points, this, while it is nice, is very optional. This, again, while nice, is optional, and in theory, you could even drop some of these connecting intelligence nodes then, pathing around this way instead. So let's go over specifically the notables and talk about why they're important. First up, these 3. They're just really point efficient. You want Energy Shield, you want ES's stun threshold, so Dampening Shield's very good. Mana Blessing for mana. That should be obvious since the entire build is scaling mana to scale damage, aka Archmage. And Rapid Recharge for Energy Shield recharge rate, because that makes the build feel much more responsive. This is very much a do it to taste kind of thing, but I would strongly recommend getting around 100 recharge delay modifier, and when you get the recharge to around 1/3 of your total pool, that feels pretty good, though again isn't strictly required. So for the same reason, Insightfulness, increased intelligence is more mana by the way, intelligence is a pretty good stat if you can get it on gear, and down to alternating current for increased magnitude of shock you inflict. Remember, shock is a multiplicative damage bonus. The higher it goes, based on shock magnitude, the better. That also means if you need a discount anoint, go with Unbound Forces. It's very cheap, and it's also very, very effective. Now, I would honestly love to take Echoing Thunder for the increased elemental damage, because shocking an enemy recently is pretty much always a thing. However, I think super late game, these nodes over here are better. But again, if you're lower level, and you're not taking the stuff up here, and you're not using a Radius Jewel, you should absolutely go for this node, as it provides a lot of value. The other thing that I went for is Psychic Fragmentation. So, this is a proc chance to get 2 additional projectiles on Fireball. If you take all of these nodes here, and then all of these nodes here, it is a 50% chance for +2 proj. Since most of the projectiles and sub-projectiles overlap, this is a significant, albeit random, damage increase. Next, Chaos Inoculation. This is really important as an ES build because Chaos does double damage to ES, and Poison completely bypasses it. Now, fun fact, as a Mind Over Matter build, the Poison bypassing maybe isn't as big of a deal, but this is still really nice, and it's a massive damage reduction, while also meaning you don't need any Chaos resistance at all on gear. Eldritch Battery, on the other hand, converts Energy Shield on gear to mana. So, if you have gear with ES and mana on it, that is the best way to get a massive mana pool and thus scale your Archmage damage. After that, take all of these because extra regen's good, Arcane Intensity is really good, gives you a lot of spell damage, and then raw mana, well, it's one of the only nodes that says increased maximum mana, so it is very potent. These nodes up here, while they are strong, are not required. It's just a matter of, are you comfortable with your recharge rate? Okay. Go with Patient Barrier. It's a good amount of ES. and Ingenuity into his mana, and also it helps you fix attribute requirements. Refocus, like I've mentioned a couple times, it's a really good recharge node, as is Dependable Ward. Now, overexposure here magnifies exposure effect. If you have 1 extra point, definitely take the exposure effect here. Unfortunately, I currently don't. Then coming down here to Heavy Buffer, 40% increased ES, good. 10% reduced max life, well, your max life is 1 because of Chaos Inoculation, so this is all upside with no downside. And filling out that wheel for the extra energy shield nodes is a good idea. Up here, Eldritch Will, this helps you prevent you from getting chain stunned, and it gives both max ES and max mana, thus adding more damage and defenses. And you even get Enhanced Barrier for +1 to all max res. That's a little bit of extra damage reduction against elemental stuff, and, you guessed it, even more energy shield. Last up, over on the left, Mind Over Matter. So, all damage is taken from mana before life. This means the order of damage taken is energy shield first. If something hits me for, let's just say 8,000, I would lose all the 7,000 energy shield, and 1,000 damage would come over here to my mana, which would then immediately begin regenerating. It has 647 unless I move, then it goes up to 780. So try to keep moving and, try to keep dodge rolling as much as possible. You'll have to stop to cast sometimes, but when you aren't casting, dodge roll around and do all that stuff. This is a really good thing because it gives you that extra layer of defense. Without it, the ES stuff does feel pretty good still, especially with Grim Feast, but it's way riskier, especially at big bosses, and you have so much regen that the downside really doesn't feel that impactful. Next up, Breaking Point, increase magnitude of non-damaging ailments. Well, Shock is a non-damaging ailment. Increasing the magnitude means enemies take increased damage, and your Lightning Conduit deals even more damage. Then, all natural, some Ellie res and some damage. Last up, this Against the Darkness is what enables Grim Feast, and it requires 3 notables within the radius. Again, I found 2 places that can support that, here and here. It just so happens that Controlled Metamorphosis, medium-large, is much better in this spot. So, here, Against the Darkness, plus 10, 20, 30 Spirit. In theory, you could drop all this and take Repulsion. That would also give a Spirit. It would give a little bit more damage, but you'd lose the stun threshold, so you'd have to take Hallowed, which costs 1 extra point, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. But hey, maybe you feel like you aren't getting stunned very much, or maybe you don't really care about getting frozen / have an additional charm slot on your belt, and you can run both stun and freeze charms. In which case, maybe you just drop this entirely, take the extra damage, and put the point elsewhere without allocating Hallowed. Then beyond that, Reverberation is really good because it gives AoE, which is important for both Frostwall and Fireball. And Calibration gives, maximum energy shield and maximum mana. So the overall goal for this tree is to get as much energy shield as possible, take all the mana stuff, take the things that specifically enhance Fireball, scale Shock, get energy shield for defenses, and take any quality of life nodes that you can find along the way. That would be stuff like cast speed, which unfortunately is in really short supply, although I guess I could path around to Mental Alacrity. Again, that would probably require dropping Turn the Clock Forward and the nodes up here. So a little bit less damage and a little bit less quality of life, because losing projectile speed is also quality of life for a different kind of quality of life. And if you're struggling on mana regen rate, I would absolutely recommend doing that. These points are very much high-level, non-mandatory stuff, not core to the build. Then Jewels. This is where things get a little bit complicated, because technically, Jewels with the meta skills gain 12% increased energy, if you're able to afford them. But you also want increased maximum energy shield. Ideally, you should have increased maximum energy shield on all of your Jewels. And you want increased magnitude of shocks you inflict. Again, ideally on every one of your jewels, which is why things could get a little bit pricey. Beyond that, recover mana on kill, really good quality of life stat. Getting things like lightning damage or spell damage, also pretty good. And hey, some quality of life stuff like maximum energy shield gained to stun threshold, that's pretty good as well, if you're able to find it. Before I was Archmage, I felt like I really needed a mana on kill. Now that I'm Archmage, and now that I've swapped to a slightly different version of a build that uses a special mana flask, I don't really need that. However, it is still very good quality of life, so having it on a couple jewels, especially if they have other good stats like this one, is absolutely worth it. Just keep in mind these jewels can get very, very expensive. Next up, gearing. So, on your weapon, you must have +4 to level of all spell skills. The higher level your spells, the higher the base damage. The higher the base damage, the better Archmage scales it because it is gain as extra. And after that, you want spell damage or lightning damage, doesn't matter which, maximum mana, and ideally mana regeneration rate or cast speed, which as you will notice I don't have. Just keep in mind that the damage as extra fire damage isn't nearly as good because it is only extra from your base. So think of this as like 300 extra mana worth of damage with Archmage. Not such a big deal when you already have 5,000 mana. Unfortunately, the Archmage does not scale off damage extra because Archmage is itself damage as extra. Next up, Snake Pit. While not strictly mandatory, it is a lot of damage. If you are able to fit for resistances, I would highly recommend getting this. Personally, I've even made sacrifices in other areas to make sure I can wear this. The cast speed rolls are really nice. The spell damage, I mean, it's nice, but not quite as important. I would very much prioritize cast speed for the quality of life over the spell damage here. And remember, it must be in your left ring slot, because if you put it in the right ring slot, instead of forking, your fireball will chain. And that's going to be very, very bad in comparison. The reason this is so important is because you instill split shot on your amulet. So projectiles have a 75% chance for an additional projectile when forking. So instead of your fireball hitting and jumping away, and then not damaging the enemy again, it hits the enemy, splits in two, both of those projectiles explode. If you're at very close range because you're shooting directly into your frost wall, the explosions damage the enemy, so it's now taken damage 3 times. Then all the secondary projectiles get shotgunned directly into the enemy's face. And remember, split shot adds a third, so instead of explosion, double explosion, it's explosion, triple explosion for even more damage. And from personal experience, I can tell you that split shot works 100% of the time, about 3 times out of every 4. So with that in mind, you're going to need something to do the heavy lifting on your resistances. And this is where your belt comes in, where you get fire, cold, and lightning res. Get as much res as possible, then look for max mana. The rest of the stats are honestly pretty irrelevant. Sure, it might be nice to have a mana recovery from flasks or mana recovery rate. Don't worry about it. Just get as much resistance and maximum mana as you are able to afford. Now for your remaining slots, gloves, look for energy shield, mana, resistances. Put in a soul core here for 2% increased max mana because there isn't really enough ES on a piece like this to give you more overall defensive and offensive value than just putting in the 2% max mana, even though that 2% max mana will not increase your energy shield because of how conversion and as extra works. Your helmet is very much the same. Look for as much energy shield as possible. And then, in this case, I would recommend an Iron Rune, at least if you have a good helmet. If your helmet is, let's say, around 200 ES, so pretty much in line with the gloves, then you could go for 2% of max mana in a soul core here, but I'm going to be honest, a 200% ES helmet, probably not worth the soul core. So instead, just stick to things like 300-ish ES. Res, as you need. Intelligence is, of course, good. Max mana. Get the stats that you're missing. On boots, the most important thing you can have is 30% movement speed. After that, get energy shield and maximum mana. Kind of similar to gloves, put a soul core in here. At least if you can afford it, go with an Iron Rune if you can't. Then for shield, +2 to level of all spell skills. This is again a huge damage boost, and I cannot stress how important that is. Beyond that, you guessed it, prefixes like energy shield and mana. Or, if you want even more damage, maybe some spell damage, because there's a point at which you already have so much mana that spell damage simply is the better option. For suffixes, energy shield recharge rate, intelligence, mana regeneration rate, maybe even, if you're lucky, you might get some cast speed here. Now, as a fun note, you don't have to wear focus. If you want to be even tankier, you can wear a shield like this. The armor doesn't really do very much, but it gives you the ability to block attacks, and at 42% block chance, this means out of every 10 attacks or spells against you, 4 of them do nothing. So that is really good. There's a couple things to keep in mind. Number 1, you need strength. Number 2, this doesn't have a spell damage, so this is a huge damage loss. You lose like 50% of your DPS. Just to give you an idea of what I mean. Here is me fighting tier 4 Xesht and barely scratching him because I'm using this shield. I am much tankier. You will notice there are times where I get hit and I completely just ignore the damage because I blocked it. But it doesn't overall feel worth it if you're going to do high-end bossing. On the other hand, if you're doing mapping, where mobs are just super dangerous and scary, and you have enough damage to obliterate everything in your map fine, that's where I would recommend using a shield, because in general, I've found that DPS requirements are much lower when mapping, and honestly, when bossing, survivability is not that big of a deal, because most of the time the boss does one big attack, and then gives you enough time for your energy shield recharge to start before using another big attack. If you want a fun little bonus, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but you can if you want. You could also put Blink on a weapon swap. This will allow you to move around faster at the potential cost of forgetting that your weapon swap setup leaves you without the ability to use your main skills and forgetting to set things up correctly to automatically swap back, and then you die and then you're sad. I'm not speaking from personal experience there, though. Now, for your chest piece, if you're going to use everything that I mentioned, you need 60 spirit. In theory, you could get around that by taking repulsion, so 4 total notables in radius. It would cost you extra points on the tree, require you to give something up elsewhere, and that might be a good stopgap, but personally I found chest pieces like this, with at least 57 spirit, are slightly more economical than I was expecting. At the very least, if you don't need very resistant suffixes. It's still going to be a couple divines, but compared to some of the other items in this build, I'd consider that to be pretty affordable. That said, if demand spikes, just go with the 4 notable option, or maybe consider playing a different version of a build that doesn't use the Everlasting Gaze. Though if you do that, you're kind of on your own because I haven't really explored that. So in short, spirit, more energy shield the better. I'd say aim for at least 400, but ideally 5 or maybe even 600. I say ideally because I don't even have 600 on my chest. I've only got 533, but right now I need resistances. Then the Everlasting Gaze. This is how you get all of the energy shield. And I mean all of it. Because if you have Eldritch Battery, your energy shield is converted over into mana. So all energy shield goes away, becomes mana. This gives you mana as extra. Because things that are granted as extra cannot be converted, you get energy shield back, and with all your increases, you get to scale it. This is pretty fun, and it adds for a very nice defensive buffer. The rolls on this, well, there's only one roll, the maximum mana as extra maximum energy shield, and if you can afford it, go for the 30%. If you can't afford it, go for the best one you can. The increased mana regeneration rate prefix, I mean, higher is better, but it's not really going to make that much of a difference either way. Oh, and PS, make sure to use a neural catalyst on it, because that makes the modifiers 20% more effective, minus the energy shield one, which is unscalable. Next up, a breach ring. Breach rings are the best way to get an absolute massive amount of mana, and also mana regeneration rate. You can also use this to fill any holes in your resistances, maybe get attributes you need. Or, if you don't need those suffixes, go for cast speed because it's a very nice quality of life stat. The rest of your prefixes, I mean, lightning damage would be ideal, but don't worry too much about that. These are already expensive enough as is. If you cannot afford a breach ring, go for a regular ring with resistances you need, mana regeneration rate, max mana. And again, cast speed is nice, item rarity is nice, lightning damage is nice, but none of those things are required, especially if you're on a budget. Now, the last thing, but certainly not least because this is part of why the video is late, is Melting Maelstrom, Ultimate Mana Flask. The most important part of this is recover all mana when used. So, if you are Archmage and you start spamming, you can burn through an unholy amount of mana, especially if you aren't using Inspiration on your Lightning Conduit. See, all that mana gone, and it's back instantly. And with 7 charges by default, more if you get a belt that generates flask charges, this is an insane amount of value. Also, you take a big hit, go down to half mana, you use this, instantly topped off, back to full mana. This flask is insane. Right now it costs 50 divines, and you absolutely do not need it to play the build. I did everything on this character, including tier 4 Xesht, including fighting Oloroth, without using this flask, specifically because I wanted to make sure it was viable without the 50 divine item. With that said, if you can afford it, should you buy it? Yes, 100%, it feels amazing. Now, last but not least, I wanted to cover crafting just a bit, and specifically the pieces that I would and wouldn't advise crafting on. So first up, I would not advise crafting a weapon. From what I found, they're kind of a pain, and it's a bit cheaper to buy. Now, if you find a good base with +2 level of all spell skills, sure, take your shot, exalt it, see what you get. Helmets, actually pretty easy to craft. The base is quite likely to roll high energy shield, and since you don't need too many specific modifiers here, you could always just go energy shield essence. Whatever you get, augment either regal or greater essence, and then just slam it and see what happens. For boots, same kind of thing, except you want an essence of haste to force for movement speed, and you really only want to aug regal if you hit something good. Though, fun fact, if you hit something good, using a greater essence is really, really good here because you can also use that to force mana. So, greater essence for mana, or greater essence for defenses to force energy shield, whatever you prefer. And then slam the rest and see what you get. Alternatively, buy boots with 30% movement speed and either mana or energy shield, and try to just exalt slam the other one. Gloves, I wouldn't advise crafting. They have a horrible modifier pool. This will be kind of expensive, but it really is your best bet. And I'd pretty much say the same for shields, just because you need the level of all spell skills, and it's a pain in the ass modifier to hit. For belt, again, pretty good. You can use fire, cold, or lightning essences to guarantee the resistances. So if you get like a 40 or 45% resistance on a good belt base, then you slam, say, mana, hit it with a greater essence, you're in a pretty good spot. Just keep in mind that greater essences could be fairly expensive, and that doesn't guarantee a third resistant suffix. You'll have to exalt slam that. So I also found that it wasn't too bad to buy one of these if you just need a decent one, but it is better to craft it if you need like 110 to 120% resistances. Breach rings, also kind of a pain, mostly just because it's a pain to actually get the bases themselves, unless you're running tier 4 Xesht. In terms of crafting, well, if you manage to get mana on it, you can force the cast speed, which is really nice, because with both double mana and cast speed, it feels really good. Mana essences you can use to try to encourage some of these mods. Just keep in mind, there's stuff like mana on kill that you don't really want. So it's not a guarantee the way the cast speed is. Ultimately, I'd say if you're doing it on a breach ring and you're willing to actually buy a whole bunch or farm them, yeah, the market's really inflated right now, so it is better to craft it. But if you're not doing this on a breach ring, just buy the ring because it's not overall that expensive. Again, at least relative to the amount of time and effort it takes to craft one of these. And for chest piece, I personally had the most success buying bases that had the spirit, maybe even some good suffixes, and slamming ES prefixes. This is because if you hit mana, it's still pretty good. Someone could use it. In fact, it could be better than hitting ES, depending on the mods. Like my current one, I'm pretty sure the 26 to 30 ES, I'd just be straight better off without that hybrid mod and with a really good mana roll. Not 100% sure, though. I haven't done the exact math on where the ES and mana would stand. Hey, maybe you hit life, you sell it to a hybrid build. Either way, there's a lot of good outcomes here, and very few bad ones. The only one I can think of is Physical Thorns. So buying a partially valuable base and investing into it is what I did to get my chess piece and what I'd advise that you do. And as for jewels, I mean, go wild. There's a lot of really good outcomes on them, but you'll want to buy them with 2 or maybe 3 good affixes and hope you get an amazing 4th. So that was a lot. You might be feeling a little overwhelmed. If you are, don't worry about it. Feel free to use the timestamps to go back and rewatch other sections of a video if there's anything you weren't sure about. But if you also want a quick reference, then I'm going to leave a link to a planner that's over on Maxroll down in the video description. Keep in mind, the planner is not a replacement for this video. It's more of a quick reference sheet if you already understand what you're doing. The exact resistances and attributes you have on your gear depends on what you need for your requirements and based on your other pieces. Don't just try to blindly copy what I did. So, where does this build stand? Honestly, I don't know, because I've only played a couple other things. I did try the Spark Lightning Conduit, and yeah, Lightning Conduit is super disgusting, but I did not like how Spark played. I tried 3 times. I tried Widow Hail, I tried non-Widow Hail. I really tried to make it work, and I just do not like Spark, and it feels weird to be a proc build, which I know is strange when I originally said I was playing Cast on Freeze, which was a proc build. Don't at me. I also tried and really wanted to like Hexblast. Hexblast has a target cap. So, if you have just about the right amount of density where it hits every monster of the area, it feels incredible. Things just explode. But the minute there's more monsters than targets, and they're spread out by just enough that they don't overlap easily, it feels awful. I might revisit that one in the future, because I think there's more cool stuff to explore, at least in terms of Hexblast. Spark, I don't know. Maybe later. Probably not for a while. With that said, there was one very big thing that surprised me about this build. Initially, I had been hesitant to go Archmage, because I thought the mana costs would be unsustainable. But it turns out, at least as a Stormweaver, the more mana you have, the easier it is to sustain your mana costs, at least if you have a couple of mana regen rolls. So, as it turns out, Archmage is more affordable than I thought. With that said, I have very good gear. I have paid multiple divines at this point for every single item I have equipped, including my jewels. So, if you don't have that level of investment, don't expect to just walk through tier 4 pinnacle bosses. First up, if your fireball damage isn't high enough to break Frostwall, you're going to struggle hard. In fact, you might even need to use a lower level Frostwall gem. Second of all, if your damage isn't high enough on Frostwall to shock enemies and expose them, you are going to feel like you do 0 DPS. The main way to fix this would be to use Conduction support, which gives you a 100% shock chance and maybe even take some shock chance nodes on a tree. These effectively mean you deal damage as if hitting that much harder. So if you have 140% shock chance, then that means you deal damage for the purposes of shock as if you damaged an enemy almost 2.5 times as much as you did, making it much easier to overcome their ailment threshold. Also, if your ES and mana is too low, you might get one-shot sometimes. Like, actually one-shot. I think once you get to about 4k ES and 3.5k mana, it should start feeling pretty comfortable. Do be careful of certain map mods like less recovery rate. Those are pretty darn awful. Also, things like minus max, enemy speed, those can be very rippy. But minus bad mods, I'd say that's where it starts to feel very good. Keep in mind, I have almost double that ES and about 1.5k more mana. More mana means more damage. More mana means more ES. More ES means more tank. And then some of the truly insane high-end upgrades, like the Melting Maelstrom, take the build from really freaking good to absolutely insane. But again, I want to stress I did a whole bunch of content and a whole bunch of testing without that item specifically because it's 50 divines. And I'm going to be honest, I don't think the game's been out for long enough that I am comfortable just telling people to buy an item that is 50 divines as a core part of a build. The radius jewels are sort of the same, where I got one as a drop. I honestly have no idea what the price is right now because the trade site doesn't really let me search for them. The other one cost me about 9 divines, which is fairly pricey. That's the spirit jewel. I do think it is absolutely worth that cost. But if that's too expensive for you and you're using a cheaper helmet, maybe corrupting a bunch of them is actually the way to go. I feel a little bit better about that though, because they aren't strictly necessary for the build to function. Though without Grim Feast, I'm going to be honest, you are going to feel significantly squishier while mapping. So if you have to put the investment anywhere, I would actually put it into getting the 190 Spirit. Or alternatively, maybe don't drop Grim Feast, but instead drop Cast on Shock. Because yes, you'll lose a bit of damage on bosses, but on bosses your Grim Feast doesn't do anything, so you can kind of just do a little bit of an aura shuffle. And if you want even more of an aura shuffle, you could try to get a low-level Overwhelming Presence. It's also a 30 reservation, so you could put that plus Grim Feast on. Use it while mapping. It lowers enemy ailment thresholds, making it easier for you to do things like shock them. But because that's a strength gem, you would need a very low-level gem, otherwise the attribute requirement would get very ridiculous very, very quickly. And so that's how I built my Archmage Fireball Frostwall character. What I did, how I crafted some of the gear, and some of the decision-making behind why I'm doing what I'm doing. Is this the best build in the game? Honestly, I don't know. I haven't played every build in the game. So I'll get back to you on a later date. I will say it feels very, very good. Even before Archmage, I could clear tier 15s. And post Archmage, I feel like I am absolutely destroying stuff. And you know what? After I put on the Melting Mana Storm, kind of feel like an unkillable god a lot of the time. So that's pretty cool. Admittedly, I probably shouldn't let that go to my head because I'm sure if I pick a rippy enough map, I will actually be able to die. And you know what? If you want to know how I got here, I'm going to link to all the videos down below showing my entire build progression, starting with when I swapped off of Cast on Freeze, all the way through to my previous endgame build, and of course the video talking about the details of how CI, Eldritch Battery, and Mind Over Matter interact with the amulet. Then that leaves the question of what I'm going to do next. And to be honest with you, I don't know. The only thing I'm pretty sure of is I'm not going to keep min-maxing this character. I might buy 1 or 2 more upgrades. I'm not super happy with my weapon, so I could probably swap that out. What I do know is I'm probably not going to buy that many more. Both because my upgrades have gone from a couple divines to dozens of divines, which is a significant price increase. And also because it's really annoying to buy an upgrade, be super excited to use it, and then you can't because you're missing attributes or resistance on the piece you just swapped out, even if the total of attributes and resistance are better on the new item. Good example of this was my gloves. I bought them and I had them in my stash for 2 days before I finally replaced my helmet, replaced my boots, replaced my chest, and was able to equip my gloves. I'm really missing the ability from Path of Exile 1 to turn any resistance into any other resistance, because that would solve a lot of these problems. Many of the replacements that I got were upgrades. They did have better stats, but they didn't really need to be. They just needed to have different resistances. I just kind of couldn't justify to myself buying an upgrade, quote unquote, without actually upgrading my gear. So yeah, that feels kind of bad, and it's discouraged me from min-maxing the character more. But hey, who knows, maybe I'll just get a spark of inspiration and come back to you with the real final, I swear, build update that's fully min-maxed later. But with that said, I'm curious. If you've played Path of Exile 1, are you missing the resistance swap? And if you have never played Path of Exile 1, would you like to be able to turn any resistances on your gear that are at least elemental into a different one of the same tier? So if you have like 36 to 40% fire res, you could turn it into 36 to 40% cold or lightning. You couldn't turn it into chaos res. You couldn't make it like 50%. None of that stuff, just within the same tier, swapping it around. Personally, I found it really cool. I think it made a lot more gear flexible and actually usable, and I'd love to see it return in Path of Exile 2. But anyway, that's enough rambling for me today. Thank you very much for watching to the end. Since you made it here, you are obligated to leave a like on the video, and I am obligated to see you next time. So that's exactly what I'm going to do.